so long they couldn't fit it on the programme. I work at the University of Sussex as a researcher, and I am a science teacher by training. I did that for 10 years in secondary school, and now I'm in a research capacity and training teachers as well. So that's my thing.
We'll unpick two things. Firstly, how we can use all the evidence that's out there in the architecture of a school. And then secondly, how as a school we can introduce architecture to create knowledge. Some context then. In the States for a while, they've played with this idea of research schools. In fact, if you look at the literature in psychology, there's meant to have been a rich interplay between psychological research and schools forever, except there hasn't been, has there? But in the States, there's this growing interest in making that relationship more substantial and making it more two-way. And our aim really in the creation of this new school is to embody that in practice. I'm driven by the idea summarised here by Professor David Reynolds more than a decade ago. Why is it that we don't have an applied science of learning? We're dealing with the mind. We have a science of the mind. Our role as teachers is to create memories of various types. Why aren't we developing a science of learning to guide practice? Now, if you were in Laura's talk earlier, she was talking about principles underpinning practice. And my view is that we know enough about the science of mind and the science of behaviour that we have principles ready to apply in the training of teachers and in practice. I'll do that at a fire station. So I've got a free school. It's called the Isaac Newton Free School. It opened 2 days ago in Norwich. It's part of the logo, a body of schools called the Inspiration Trust, run by a CEO called Rachel D'Souza. And I bumped into her a year and a half ago. And what intrigued me about her was that she was a serial school transformer. I didn't know her, but I saw her take 2 schools from inadequate to outstanding. And when that happened the second time in Norwich, where I'd lived for 10 years, I did the logical thing of knocking on the door and asking how. Interestingly, no one else did locally, and I think that was a missed opportunity. So I've got this lovely fire station. It will become a specialist science and maths school. At the moment, like many free schools, are in temporary buildings, but that's okay. Things are working and the kids are excited, my staff are ready, let's move on. My aim really in school is to use Daniel Coyle's idea to create talent and genius. There are 2 ingredients, I won't dwell on the first, but we need to ignite passion. We bemoan the lack of aspiration. Let's not leave aspiration to serendipity, let's provide it through experience. So there's a whole lot of stuff going on in terms of ignition. Visiting scientists, careers being unpicked, futures being offered to young people as tangible goals. The second part of Coyle's model is, of course, what we're interested in most, this brilliant teaching, this practice in classrooms, this practice in the curriculum that promotes incredible learning. Coyle's view is that they are the 2 determinants of high-level success. Which means we've got to really unpick what leads to brilliant teaching, to teacher expertise. And there are a lot of false prophets, and that's my point really in this slide. We go and seek gurus. There are no gurus that I can find yet that will tell us what teacher expertise properly is. So going back to Laura's principles, what can we unpick? Whether it be in training staff or developing staff. And I come back to Garnson, because I think Garnson gives us some focal areas. Firstly, you've got to know content, and the best teachers know the best way to structure that content. Secondly, and I think this is really my focus today, the best teachers have a broad repertoire of effective techniques. Thirdly, we know our students. We're better with students that we know rather than new ones. And if we know how people learn through a cognitive lens, I think our practice is informed. And of course, we've got our own beliefs about ourselves and what we do, and the mind, and to get on with people. So Garnson, in my view, gives us some focal areas that drive expertise. Why is that important? Well, I think it's important because student achievement, and I do love Gage's model, if you come across it, have a little look. The student achievement has got a number of domains that feed in. Of course, students come from different backgrounds, different homes, different socio-economic circumstances, different levels of background. And of course, teachers come into the profession with different personality traits. They all have influences on student achievement, as does how teachers think about young people and about the nature of intelligence or confidence or the malleability of ability itself. For us, and let's be clear, you can influence that, but for us, the process of teaching is where I think we need some principles to guide what we get people to do in the million minutes that young people are in classrooms for. And of course, the mind of the student is pretty critical to all this. They're not passive, we know that. So, very briefly, a Marzano model. And I've carried this around and used it with staff in different institutions for 3 years. An effective school, according to Marzano, is built upon these 3 areas. Really effective teaching and learning. We'll unpick that shortly. Students managed in the right way. Sometimes I talk about staff being managed in the right way, but not today. The right curriculum, and something that Marzano neglected was this whole non-cognitive sphere. If you're designing a school from the outset, then the kind of material I've been discussing needs to embody itself in the design of the school. I don't have a pre-existing tradition. I have staff that are malleable and will think about the principles that I present to them and adopt them. It's quite a privileged position, really. So, I won't dwell on this, but if you want to, what is that there? Social, emotional aspects of learning. What a red herring, eh? You spent millions on that, and if you look at the research that came out a year ago about its effectiveness, 0. And that's the trouble with this character stuff. The research base that supports character development is pretty thin. And in the States, there have been a number of character development programs that have led to nothing. So although I've got a colleague, an assistant principal, who's really keen on non-cog development, you have to be very careful about what you focus on, because a lot of it is snake oil. However, we're looking at 3 areas, and if you email me, I can put you into contact with my colleague who's doing this work, that we think is supported very well by research in terms of actions and interventions that develop these 3 capacities. These 3 capacities in particular, because they seem very well linked to achievement. Okay? So if you're looking for a non-cog program for your school or for your classroom, my colleague's done some work for you, because these 3 seem to be quick wins. There are techniques, there's a reasonable amount of literature that underpins each of those, but they're probably worth exploring first. But I'm really interested in what the teacher does in the short time that I've got, rather than the mind, the confidence, the non-cog of the students. So, teacher expertise intrigues me. What is expertise? Well, I think we need to start defining some of these terms. Expertise, most importantly, is domain specific. And I broaden that. A teacher in one type of school who gets incredible value added, put them in a second, very different type of school, performance is radically different, because their experience and their accumulated skills are for that first type of school. They'll change, but domain specific is an important point. Where do you start thinking about the individual skills then that underpin expertise? I'm convinced that wherever you've gone, you've heard about Hattie and Petty and effect sizes, so I'm not mentioning them at all. I'm ignoring them, because you know that we have a list of areas that perhaps should guide us in terms of developing teacher practice. It's not perfect. There are issues about meta-study data. They're not really based on RCTs in the main, but we do have the beginnings of a list that we should be mindful of in our schools. We've also got this emerging science of cognitive psychology, this emerging science of the mind. And a couple of years ago, it was treated in a kind of vague, offhand way. People hadn't heard of it. I think now we're emerging into a kind of period of phase transition, the paradigm shifts that you hear about. I think more and more our understanding of the mind will inform the development of teachers,